Hi, this is Michael Polozola with the LSU AgCenter, and today I wanted to revisit pecan grafting. So we've previously done a video on 4-flap grafting. Another less common form of grafting for pecans is whip and tongue. It's very common in other commodities, but not as commonly used in pecans. But it's very useful for smaller material, and a neat trick you can use is you can whip and tongue the top, and then if that doesn't take, you can do 4-flap grafting further down to make you have two chances at getting a successful graft. Now, you're going to have the best luck with whip and tongue grafting if you do it when the tree is either dormant, but about to come out of dormancy like this, or within this stage. Because we want the sap to be moving a little bit so that it's moving to where we're hoping that new graft union forms, but we don't want it to be so actively moving that the cambium layers can slip up a little bit. Now, don't be afraid to try whip and tongue at this stage if it's a smaller tree and you want to try to get that two chances out of it. But in some cases, if the tree is large enough and actively growing like this, you may just want to wait a week or two longer and look into doing 4-flap grafting, which will be much more successful when the tree is actively growing. But it's now a great opportunity for the trees, especially still like this, to go ahead and do whip and tongue grafting. Now we're going to look into some other steps of the process. Okay, so now I'm unwrapping some sign wood. It was in a clear plastic trash bag to also keep it moist and wrapped with this fabric. We talked a little bit in a previous video about storage and processing of sign wood, and this is all nice smaller wood that's going to be very useful for whip and tongue grafting. And you can still feel it's very moist, see it's very moist, and if I was not going to finish all of this wood in one day, I would definitely need to re-wet it, re-wrap it up before putting it up, ensure it's keeping its moisture. And actually feeling this one, it's right, it stayed just moist enough to be useful, but it wouldn't hurt to add some more moisture certainly in between putting it back. So this is the sign wood we're going to be using. A lot of good smaller wood is very useful for the whip and tongue. Some of the larger wood down here, it gets to be very difficult to do whip and tongue on larger things. It's certainly possible, but takes some skill level to get comfortable. So sometimes it's better to focus on learning whip and tongue with smaller wood that you can cut more comfortably. So the way I do my cuts, you see how I'm doing this to kind of working and feather the wood. That's why I like to wear gloves, because if out in the day with a bunch of little cuts here, because I work with a sharp grafting knife. So you may want to wear some gloves once you know how it works and you have confidence that you're not going to cut yourself, because you do have to worry, since this not being Kevlar, make certain you're using safe cuts and not causing a problem. So I do have my grafting knife sharpened about every 150, 200 grafts. Even though this particular knife is really good and probably could go 1,000 without needing it, but you hurt yourself on a dull knife, not a sharp knife. So feather it off. Now the only bad part, this is a piece of sign wood we just set aside after the initial cut to do a different one. This is really too dry down to want to use. You're not going to have good success rate. We put it aside. If you're going to take a while between, you may want to get a cup of water to be able to drop your signs in. But the cut on this is excellent, which is why I wanted to save it and show it to you. But we're seeing it's still drying down. Don't use it. Once you see this starting to turn more brown as opposed to green, you really need to put it aside and get a separate piece of sign wood. Or when I'm grafting a bunch and I know I'm going to have a small delay, I'll keep just a little cup of water, I'll dip it in. Now just kind of a close-up of the angle we would do on the sign wood. So I like to do that about 1/3 down this way or 2/3 up this way is where I do that angle versus corresponding for the half for the rootstock. But you kind of want to go down at that angle and then you kind of level off. Now, you heard a little split. This one was a little bit, I don't like how that cut out. I can correct that by binding it up tightly, but say you make a mistake and go like this. that is not a piece you're going to want to use. You're going to want to restart. Or you can just make another cut up here. So this is going to happen sometimes if it's not leaving you enough scion wood up here, which one thing we want to talk about is you want to have several good buds, but probably about 6 to 8 inches worth of scion wood to work with. So this might be a bit on the short side. It certainly would. But if it was the only thing I had that lined up, I would probably still use it. But there's several things to consider with scion wood in doing these cuts. But this was just an example to show what a good cut looks like and then how you can accidentally mess one up. So here we are. If you're going to be grafting a significant number of trees, whip and tongue method, it may be useful to invest in producing a stand like this. This greatly reduces the stress of the repetitive cuts, and the way it holds the tree in place, it greatly reduces the chance that you'll cut yourself. And we'll go ahead and we'll show how to graft one on the stand like this, but I understand that a lot of people are not going to graft enough to need or invest in something like this. We will also show how to graft on a tree on top of a bench as well and show you the similar process. Okay, so we're going to look at where we want to do our initial cut to put our graft. There's a lot of good places up here. If you have a lot of bigger scion wood, we may want to go further down because we are going to want to try to line up diameter of our scion wood and our root stock for this type of grafting so that they form a nice union. Now, it's very hard to get perfect on both sides, and sometimes you just have to aim for lining up the cambium on one side really well, and that's okay. And like we mentioned earlier, if for some reason it doesn't work up here, we can go further down and do a 4-flap graft later. But I'm going to go a little bit higher just to reduce the stress long term on my hands, because when you've done about 1,000 in a season like I do, you start to develop a little aches in your hands, and you want to find out which tricks you can do to help reduce the stress. And I find starting on a little bit of smaller wood, like up here, greatly reduces the stress on my hands. So we've made this initial cut here, and I'm going to go to where I have the scion wood and try to line up a piece. This one would work. It's just a tad bit smaller than I want. This one is a little bit bigger, but I would prefer it to be a little bit bigger than a little bit smaller, just off of my experience. So the first cuts I'm going to want to make is going to be on my piece of scion wood, and we have a separate vise that we're going to move to. So this is the piece of scion wood we looked at. Now go ahead and check and make certain it has good viable buds. We have 1, 2, and this one might be, depending on how we cut it. This is going to be a tricky piece of wood to go off of because I generally prefer not to have buds at the bottom. But the angle this is going to be, I think I will go ahead and have it because we're going to cut this way and it's going to cut this out and it won't affect. If it was the other way around like this, it will cause it to flare out because if you look, buds kind of flare out with the growth there and it's a bit bigger. So ideally, you want to look for an internodal or interbud space for this, but you can make it work with this, and we are going to. Now, to put this in the vise, I want to make certain that I'm not crushing that first bud up there, so I'll either want it to be up at the top where I can see it or below there like that. But I think we're going to go ahead and put this in like this. The lovely part about putting it in here is you greatly reduce one of the risks of if this is holding it for you and it's tight, you're not going to be holding it only working with one hand. Working with both hands with your grafting knife is going to help a lot as far as reducing your risk of cuts. So I'm looking at the length and where I want to do my initial cut. I do want to see if I can't preserve this bud on the other side here as a viable bud. Now, as you get your confidence, sometimes it's better to do longer cuts because that's more surface area. But I find I do better with cuts about this long, and I kind of will get a feel for it. Now, this is a trick I use. I often do that initial cut to take that off, and it makes it easier to come back and do some of my later cuts. If you're really good at it, you can often get it done with one fell cut, but it's okay if it takes you several cuts. So one thing I like to look at, see, I angled that incorrectly. I want to be able to line this up and it be flat. Here I see that there's a little divot right there, and I can just kind of work this a little bit to get rid of that and make it angle better down. And you see we're going to have lots of good cambium surface area. That green layer, we're trying to line up the green layers on both of them. Now this is flaring out a little bit. We also want to do something called feathering off. Now if you look real close down here, you can see where that's a very, very, very small necrotic layer from where it was initially processed. You want to see something only that small. That tells you you're working with high quality scion wood. If it was going up a little bit further, you would even want to cut off some. But this is really so small, it's nearly insignificant. A lot of times when I'm feathering, it just naturally comes off anyway. After you've done a lot of these in a day, it sometimes takes your later cuts to be able to do it in one fell swoop. So I'm happy with this one. Now we're going to quickly, because you don't want to leave this exposed to the air too long, move over to our rootstock tree where we're going to make a corresponding cut, and we're going to want to compare and get it about the same length. So I found that my cut is going about this long on the other, so I want to come at least down here. So we did the other cut. This is the angle. This is good feathering. You can see right here, feathers down. You can see where it's coming a little loose. That's because the tree is actively growing. Might be better when it's a little bit dormant rather than have to worry about that. But I'm real happy with right here. Now there's different strategies that you can use on making your kind of groove or tongue cuts. But for me, I look about the heartwood here and choose about halfway down of that heartwood and go ahead and make my cut about this half the length of the blade down is where I decide to go. Now to make it line up on the other for the scion wood is not going to be at the halfway mark. It's actually going to be about the 2/3. So I'm going to go through and do a similar type cut there. And now we're going to try lining the two up together. So we're looking at it. It may be hard to get it lined up perfectly. And this is one where you're going to look and see that it's not. It's not lined up perfectly, but it is lined up fairly nice here. There's a lot of pressure that that little groove cut made for us. Look at this. We can wiggle it like that and it's still not moving too much. Now I like to angle mine to a sense where I have connection right here and then I have good connection up here. Now we're going to go ahead and wrap it up still where we have good tension. And the way I like to wrap it up with this kind of elastic rubber band, I like to start in the middle where I have my groove. There we have it held in place. I'm going to go ahead and get the bottom held in place. And sometimes I can go and independently adjust the top part a little bit to get the better connection I want. And adjusting it like that, it worked fine since we were intact on the bottom there. Now, this can be sometimes one of the trickiest parts. I'm going to put my finger here. Voila, it's held in place there. That pressure that this adds will hold it in place. And it looks real good, and we're going to come back and wrap this with parafilm to keep it moist because we want to keep this in as moist and humid environment as possible to encourage callus formation and ensure that we're getting good healing going on. So I like to start at the top when I'm wrapping, and you notice I'm pulling this very thin at the top. There's a reason for that. You want it to be thin enough that your buds can poke through easily. And then when I come to the bottom, I'm not getting it as thin, and I'm going to re-wrap in the areas where I made my cuts because I want this to last longer on this area so that it can heal up nicely and stay in that nice, cool, humid environment just a tad bit longer. So here we are. We have a successfully, at least performed, whip and tongue graft, and we'll have to see how it follows through for us for the remainder of the season. And I think next we'll go ahead and look how to do it in a bench or tabletop setup so that you can do it more easily replicated at home. Now we're going to look at more of a tabletop situation. I'm still going to use the vise for my scion wood cuts because it's just safer for me to do and it's easier for me to show you. You're going to want to be careful doing it with hands without the vise because it is going to take a little bit more. Feel free to work with the wood. Don't feel like you have to get that first cut all the way because it often requires a little bit more force doing that, and you might accidentally cut yourself. But as far as bench grafting goes, there's some trees, although this tree is big and would have done fine on the stand, I've been grafting some smaller ones that didn't do quite well on it, and it's been useful to have it. Now you see I'm kind of using this old bench. You're going to find that you're going to need to adjust your height depending on where you're grafting up here. I found when I was using the tabletop here, it was just a tad bit too tall and I was having to cut at inconvenient angles. May still have a little bit of that if I graft this one a bit tall, but we're going to go ahead and cut off and see where we're at there. So we're going to again try to match up our sign wood. That piece is a little too big and a little bit too much at an angle I don't care for. That one's a little too small for me. This one's a little big, but I think I can make it work. And I'm going to show you another trick that sometimes you can use to kind of correct the angles on a poor piece of sign wood that goes at an angle. Let's double check though. Yes, we do have good buds there. So sometimes if it's going at the angle like this one is a weird angle, you kind of can cut with that angle out if you do angle it correctly. Now, you saw where that bud was there. I was cutting mainly to correct for the angle, and you can see where it flares out to be a little wider here. That is just an unfortunate way that it works when you're having a bud in the middle of your graft there, but you can make it work. You may just only get cambium lining up on one surface if that's the case, and that's okay. That's all we need for it to be able to take successfully. So it's still flaring out a little bit here, and I'm trying to cut to correct that, and I'm fairly happy with that now. And we have a nice wide surface area cut. We're going to cut here. It can be tricky. You see how it pops up a little bit like that? That is the benefit of having the stand. Some of these you may actually want to graft on the ground and hold your foot there. But you get a good start at it going. You can sometimes do it, but I'm not liking how that's cutting. We're going to move just for a safety issue. So here I'm able to use the leverage, hold it in place, kind of working at that angle that I'm trying to get that same length there, and also feathering the end out so that it doesn't come out at a weird angle afterwards. You'll find you're never going to get them to line up completely smooth, or very rarely, because trees grow at angles as well. So don't feel bad if you're not getting that perfect cut lining up. That's normal. Now we're going to move this up back here now that I feel safe after making that shaping cut. So like we mentioned before, I'm going to click about halfway of my heartwood. Sometimes it lines up where this little center is, but it doesn't always. But that'll give you a good hint of where to be looking. So I'm going to start making my little downward cut. Another thing to consider is you may want to angle it at first inward before you straighten out just a little bit. Because if you try to go just straight down, sometimes you end up just shaving off in the opposite direction. So make certain you're going in at that angle initially. So you see how I'm going in at the angle here and then straightening out a little bit. So this is not a very pretty one connecting, but it's much better on this side. I have it lined up. And don't forget that when you're binding it up, you can force them to be close together. So this is not my ideal. We will watch it and see how it does. But this one's big enough that I can go back and flap on it afterwards if it turns out that I did not give it enough cambium connection. So like before, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And it's not unusual for them to pop loose every now and then. So I'm liking the connection on the bottom. and it's the top that is not quite angled where I would prefer it to be. But we'll watch this tree and see how it does. And because we're doing it early, we have the opportunity to go back and do 4-flap grafting later on to salvage it if for some reason it doesn't work. Now this is a longer one. I really want to get just a little bit of extra pressure there. I wasn't satisfied with how I was able to bind it with just one. So I'm going to go through and do a second one to get a good top being pressure going there. So you may need to go through on some of them and do two just to get the proper binding in on there. So now I'm a little bit happier with how this is held together. You should be able to not have to worry about it. The one reason I do like whip and tongue, you can do this and not be worried about it. 4-flap, you do that, it wiggles a little bit too freely. You're going to have some issues. So this really does the holding it together in its natural grooves there, gives you added pressure. Plus you adding this, it's a very secure graft. So the next step we're going to take is wrapping it up. I like to start at the top again to make certain that I'm doing it just nice and thin there, and then it's easier to just continue wrapping around here to keep this nice and moist so that we get that good callus tissue forming. It doesn't take a lot of connection to get it going there initially. So we should be all right. This should be good. But we'll watch it and see. But what the main benefit of this in pecans, if this doesn't take about a month to a month and a half from now, we can go back and do the banana or 4-flap or 3-flap method down here, and we have 2 chances of getting a successful pecan graft as opposed to 1 generally with the 4-flap method. So sometimes there's a lot of advantages to whip and tongue. One is the time of year you can do it. So we can do it as the trees are coming out of dormancy or still in dormancy, but that's a narrow window. So sometimes people like the 4-flap because they can do it later in the season. But this gives us the opportunity, if we do it early spring before the pecan trees wake up all the way, they may still be leafing out a little bit, or you can even start a few weeks early and there still should be some sap movement to hopefully help it. But I like it for being able to use smaller wood than you could on the 4-flap because it's much easier to cut. We've gone ahead and done this in 2 easy cuts. For a smaller piece of wood, I'm not going to aim for as much length, but this is a nice good cut, should form up real well, and we're going to move and make the corresponding cuts on the tree over here. So able to go through, we're making that corresponding feathering out, which is making certain it goes to a nice fine point there. This should, I'm going to compare the length on the 2 on this versus my scion wood, good equivalent lengths. I'm going to go and make the tongue or groove cut at a small little angle right here. Going to make the corresponding one on this other wood at the 2/3 or 1/3 depending on how you're looking at it point. We're going to take these 2, line it up, and this is one of those good pieces where we've lined it up just perfectly. Having it feathered at the ends means that you can get a nicer cut like this. It's a little bit less surface area than some of the other larger ones we've done, but this is such a smooth, well together cut that I have great confidence in this one. And we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. And we're going to wrap it up. This added pressure is going to greatly help with the healing process. On this one, as a lucky coincidence, we have it lining up on both sides. Oops, see that happens? That's why I like to hold it a little bit once I've gotten it halfway so I don't lose the whole wrap up. Once you get better, that doesn't happen. But you see, that's still happening with me, and I've done nearly 1,000 of them this year. Get that nice tension there that's going to hold real well, and we're going to go ahead and seal it up with some paraffin tape. starting with the top. And we went just a little bit slower so you can see it on video better. But one of the advantages of this over the 4-flap is we were able to do this fairly rapidly. You can do many of these very quickly, and for the 4-flap, sometimes it's a little bit slower for people to get started. Once you get the confidence, you should be able to do 100 in a day on either method, but this one sometimes is easier to hit that 100 level quicker because you can go through this whole step, have them lined up very quickly. Especially if you have someone helping you move the plants, you can get more than 100 done quite easily. And there we go. We have hopefully what will be a successful whip and tongue graft here. So here we are revisiting some of the trees I grafted just about maybe 30 minutes to an hour later. And you can see this one was very dormant. Sap is not really coming out. So this one is actively growing, and you can see that it's bleeding a bit. And that's normal to see on a tree where it's moving. That hopefully shows us that there will be active callus formation there and that it will form a good graft union. But some people would definitely prefer to do it before something like this happens so that they're not losing sugar or sap like that. But there's some times where you just have to go ahead and graft when you can, and this is okay. It shouldn't negatively affect the graft healing or formation in any way. But sometimes people definitely prefer to do whip and tongue when it's at a more dormant state, and that won't occur. And you can look and see across different seedling pecan trees, that's what these were grafted on, our rootstock. These were started at the same time, and one was genetically different, actively growing. One was genetically different and still dormant. So there's going to be, no matter how well you time it, some might not be in the quite right growth stage, and that's because we're using seedling rootstock, and that's okay.